Welcome to my devlog.
For this week, I reworked the environment a bit. I tried to improve the appearance of space. And the very obvious first thing to see is I added atmospheric fog, which I think improves the atmosphere quite a bit. And I also modeled 15 asteroids in Blender procedurally, UV'd and textured them. And I placed them in clusters around the level. I think it improves the appearance quite a lot. And I also reworked the sky. I gave the stars a more differentiation in their size and brightness. I made the sun more alien, and I also increased the size of the nearest planets, because it was a bit of a shame to have them be so small. I also changed the character model. I added a stand-in mannequin that is of the correct size for the final player model, and I reduced the jump height. So before, the little guy could jump very high, but now you can do about 2.5 meters. And the height and scale is correct for what I want. I also worked on the camera collisions a bit more. If you remember from a few weeks ago, I was talking about the camera, third-person camera, and having obstacles move the camera. If I go near a wall and I try to move my camera in, the camera should be pushed out of the wall. And I adjusted that so that when you have an obstacle that is between you and the camera will push towards the player. The engine has a layer system for its physics, so I can decide which things should collide with which other things by putting them on layers and then masking things for certain layers. So for example, the player will collide with the enemies and the environment, but not with the projectiles. Using that system, I can give certain geometry in the world the flag that the camera should never be behind it. So for these outer walls, for example, the camera will be pushed towards the player, but with some other elements in the world, for example, these columns, if the column is between the camera and the camera will not be pushed, but for the floor or the walls, for example, it will be. This can produce a short moment of clipping because the camera needs to pass through the object, but I think that's acceptable. Here's one thing to consider. If you want to shoot, where should the bullet originate and where should it go to? Because the gun, which is currently this little black box, is not in the center of the screen. So when you shoot, if it's physically correct, you would expect the bullet to go along the axis of that box. So if I shoot now, you can see that that's somewhat what's happening, not exactly. If I keep shooting, because currently the gun is moving, you would expect the bullets to all end up a little differently. And that is what's happening. You can see that they are moving a bit. However, when I aim here, I want the bullet to hit that spot. And that's what's happening. And if I aim into outer space, that's also fine. But if I aim at this spot, something unexpected happens. And that is that the bullet does not go into outer space, but instead it hits that object. And the reason for that is that you need to decide where the bullet goes, because otherwise you cannot aim. So where do we aim at? Currently it's the center of the screen, and we're taking the camera, which we are currently using to look at the screen, and we're going along the forward axis, a certain distance. Currently that is the maximum distance the bullet can travel. I have set that somewhere, maybe 200 meters. So if I shoot, then a point 200 meters ahead of the camera will be chosen, unless something is in the way. So in this case, the point that is chosen will be the intersection from going from the camera forwards until it hits an object. And then from that point to the gun, I will draw a straight line, and that is the trajectory of the bullet. So in this situation, actually aiming up will make the bullet go down. But I don't know if there's a better solution for this, because this is kind of just how physics work. So I need to find the point that the bullet will impact, so I can draw a line from the gun towards the desired impact of the bullet. If there's nothing, then I need to go a certain distance. I need to still decide a point to which the bullet will travel. That makes aiming at certain enemies quite tricky. If they're on the ground, it's not really a problem, but aiming at the rockets, for example, can be quite tricky, because they are against open space. So if I try and shoot at it, because it's moving, it's very hard to hit them. And sometimes you can see the bullets not behaving exactly how you would expect. So I don't know if there's anything I can do to solve this. Maybe I need to make the collider larger. Maybe it'll be fine if I don't use the rockets in open space, but instead have some walls behind. I will need to test that. Also, I need to see in the final game if it actually makes a difference. Another thing I added is a health counter in the top right. I picked 1,000 health points as an arbitrary starting point. But it is working, so if we go down here to these enemies that I showed before, whenever they touch me, they will push me back and also deal damage. So you can see, and I added an effect, a blood effect on the screen, and this will add up. So currently, every time I get an impulse, depending on how much damage I take, the opacity of that effect will increase. And it will build up, so you can see that it can get quite intense. And then just over time, it will fade away. It might take a bit because it got quite high, but yes, it will fade away. And I can keep pushing these guys and go to negative health, but that is just temporary. And the enemies, of course, have the same functionality, so if I shoot them, I will inflict a certain amount of damage, and once their health is below 0, they will be destroyed. And I need to add a certain effect, a death effect. I'm thinking either I make a generic explosion that will scatter a few random debris around, that can then be rigid bodies and interact with the physics system of the environment. Or another way is to have the enemy fade away. Maybe the color can change to white and it can look like they melt away. I can write a custom shader for that. That is another option, which would be a somewhat easy way to make all enemies have a death animation. The goal is that the player can very easily tell once the enemy has been defeated, but to not be too obtrusive. Currently, the player health and weapon status are just overlays on the screen, but I would actually like to make them part of the player model itself. So maybe on the backpack, or the color of the gun could change depending on how much heat has been built up. And when it's overheated, it could be glowing red hot, for example, and then slowly cool down, so that I don't need to use UI elements and instead make it more immersive by removing any HUD elements that aren't strictly necessary. So now let's go to the area with the enemy I put most time in this week. This is the expander type I was talking about before. And I brought this enemy to a reasonably finished level. This was a proof of concept for my procedure for making enemies. So I sculpted the model and I retopologized it, textured it, and then animated these 3 movements. So idle state, expanding, and contracting. And I also gave the enemy custom collision shapes for hit detection. For movement, the enemy is just using a simple collision sphere, but for being shot at, I have 8 hitboxes, 1 for each of the shell pieces, and they all can have an individual scaling amount. So when you shoot these regular shell pieces, it will do standard damage, whereas if you shoot the piece that is holding the stone, it will do double damage. Using the rifle, if I want to shoot the enemy, I will need about 5 shots, whereas if I shoot at the vulnerable spot, I only need 3. Because it does double damage. And when the enemy is expanding, there's a sphere that will show the radius of that expanding sphere. And if the player enters that sphere, instead of taking immediate damage, a damage over time effect will be triggered. Whenever you enter the sphere, you will get 1 instance of that effect. So if there are a lot of those enemies, you can stack a lot of those effects. So if you keep re-entering the sphere, you will stack them. But if you stay inside, you will not repeatedly keep getting damaged for that. Because geometry in 3D games is one-sided, generally, so you cannot see the sphere from the inside, but you still should be able to tell whether the effect is going on or not. So I added a second sphere inside the enemy, and when the sphere is expanding, it will increase in size, so you can tell even from inside that currently the effect is going on. Whereas if it's not going on, it's just a little sphere that shows that the energy is there. Additionally, I made the inside of the enemy be emissive, so just like the rockets, it's easy to locate the enemy in a dark room. If there are multiple instances of the same enemy, they will of course share materials and all these kind of things. So you would expect, if I trigger multiple of these expanding enemies at the same time, that all those sphere effects would be the same among them. But they are not, because in the custom shader that I programmed for the effect, I added an offset depending on the world position of those enemies. So each expanding sphere will have a unique scrolling pattern in my shader. Another thing I did was to change the colors a bit. Now player projectiles are blue and the enemies are all more in the yellow and red spectrum. So it should be very obvious which things are hostile to you and which are not. And I can imagine some of the other weapons I will design might have very slow moving projectiles. I'm not sure yet if I want friendly fire or not. So if you have a very slow moving projectile, it's very possible you might be confused whether it's yours or an enemy's in the heat of battle. So that's why I want some quite clear color coding for these kind of things. That is what I got done this week. I'm very satisfied with how that expander enemy turned out. One of the next things I want to do is make an enemy shoot back at the player, because currently it's more about avoiding obstacles in a way than bullets. And that is definitely going to be a part of the final game as well. So come back next week to see how I did. And thank you for watching.